Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in this very exciting conversation around seed sovereignty and the future of our food. I'm going to give a few minutes. I see people are coming in, joining us. Welcome, wherever you're joining us from. We have quite an international crew joining us for today's conversation, from our speakers and attendees as well, which makes me really excited because this is globally relevant topic that impacts all of us, no matter where we're coming from and tuning in from. So, well, for those of you that haven't joined us for previous farm yarns, or maybe you have too, we started these curious conversations with the farmers footprint community about 6 months ago, probably at this point. And the intention really came from seeing that there were different topics that came our way that members of the team or our community were really curious about. And we realized that it felt really needed to have these spaces where we could come in from a place of curiosity and sit in conversation with people who have dedicated their lives to these different topics. So today's Farm Yarns conversation will be focused on seed sovereignty and the future of our food. We often hear about farm to table and the importance of farm to table. Well, often, but not often enough. And today's conversation will really focus on seed to table and how it all starts at the seed. And when we affect our seeds or do something with a seed, that really does ripple throughout the rest of our food system. And it touches not just our biology and our environment, but also on economic, political areas of our lives and communities. So for today's conversation, we invited our three special speakers who are joining us from the US, New Zealand, and Mexico. And we're really honored to have them join us for this conversation today because they really bring really diverse perspectives to this topic. So we hope to be able to expand our perspective on seeds and how they impact so many different areas of our lives. So I'm gonna start by briefly introducing our speakers. So we have Jessica, who is joining us from New Zealand. Zia is a Maori food sovereignty leader, researcher, and Hua Parakore, a Maori organic farmer. She has spent over 30 years advancing Indigenous food systems, environmental well-being, and social justice. She's also a founding trustee of the Papawhakari Torito Charitable Trust and promotes sustainable farming and the revitalization of Maori foodways. Thank you, Jessica, for joining us. We also have Kiira, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Non-GMO Project. And she's also involved with the Nutrient Density Alliance and the Soil and Climate Alliance. And over here, we have Emmanuel González-Ortega, who is a research professor at Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana de México. And his focus is on maize biodiversity and the effects of releasing genetically modified organisms. His research spans molecular biology, genetics, biosafety, biosecurity, and risk assessment. He was also the subdirector of biosafety at the Instituto Nacional de Ecología y Cambio Climático and has published research on topics such as herbicide impact and antiviral research. Thank you all so much for joining us in today's conversation. I will pass it over to you now in case you want to share anything that I might have missed.
Jessica, please. I don't know if... Yes, hello, kia ora. Well, atamari everybody, good morning from our part of the world down in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I hail from the tribal lands of Ngāi Tahu and Ngāti Huirapa, which is down in the South Island. And on the other side of my whakapapa, whakapapa is probably at the essence of my conversation of sharing today, which is our deep ancestral connections and genealogy. So on that side of the other side of my whakapapa, I come from Gujarat, from India. So mixed race, Indigenous Aotearoa, Māori and Indian. And I've been farming a beautiful piece of land for 22 years now, listening to the vibrations and the spirit and the energies of both whenua soil and seed. And sometimes I call myself a recovered academic, having done a very long time in the institutions of white knowledge production. And now I'm a freelance Indigenous researcher running a charitable trust, elevating everything to do with seed, soil and food sovereignty. Like everywhere in the world, we are under attack at the moment from very right-wing government. And we've just had a big gene deregulation bill put through a first reading in the House. So things are really at threat for us, and really appreciate the opportunity to come and share some of our whakaaro or our thoughts and our ideas around what we're doing in Aotearoa.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jessica. Kiira, do you want to go next?
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having the Non-GMO Project here with you all, Farmers Footprint. We really appreciate it. My name is Kiira. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships, Learning and Community for the Non-GMO Project. And I've been with the group for over 8 years now, focusing on our unique tool in the system, which is retail food. And we're a 501c3 nonprofit that's really focused at its heart on education and outreach to eaters. So activating eaters to make choices that can better impact their personal health and therefore the health of the environment. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about our market intervention today, the history of GMOs, and what we've done to kind of codify that, at least in the North American market. So thank you for having us. Yeah.
Thank you, Kiira.
Hello, everyone. I'm Emmanuel González-Ortega from Mexico. I have all the, let's say, the pedigree for being a biotechnologist. I made an engineering formation in biotechnology, then the master's in science in biotechnology, then the PhD in biotechnology. So I have all this background to be like in the other side of the of the defense of the seeds and the position of the privatization of seeds. Nevertheless, being here in Mexico, inserted in this reality that is all the complexity, all the richness, all the biodiversity, biocultural diversity, it would be impossible for me to be in the other, let's say, in the other side of this match. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks to Farm Yarns and Farmers Footprint, and well, I'll be as indicated by our guests. I'll be somehow like answering in a very executive manner the topics we were asked to. So I think there will be some time to specifically answer to questions from the public. So thanks again.
Thank you, Emmanuel, and thank you for joining us on this side of the conversation today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Okay, well, without further ado, we have a lot to cover today. It's a very ambitious run of show. We just couldn't hold ourselves having these 3 incredible speakers here. We wanted to ask all of the questions, so I'm just gonna go ahead and jump right in. So the first question today is for you, Jessica, to help us get grounded in this conversation. Could you share with us from your perspective, what is seed sovereignty and food sovereignty? And why are they essential for building resilient food systems?
Sure. So first of all, just in terms of the standpoint in which I'm talking from, I'm very much, of course, talking from my personal standpoint of being Indigenous to these lands of Aotearoa. And my research work in communities with Indigenous communities, understanding seed, soil and food sovereignty. And when we talk about food sovereignty from that standpoint, how I often describe it is as Indigenous people having the ability to return to eat from our cultural landscapes, to eat from those landscapes which are the manifestations of our deity, our Earth Mother, Papa Tuanuku, our Sky Father, Rangi Nui, Haumi Tiki Tiki, our deity of cultivated foods, Tangaroa of the oceans. So it's not merely food as being devoid from spirit, but food as a manifestation of the atua, of the deities, not only from who we come from, but from who we are a manifestation of. So food sovereignty, returning to eat our cultural landscapes from an Indigenous standpoint, and it actually means we end up consuming our culture through our gut bacteria. And when we stop doing that, when our food systems have been colonized and we end up eating food off the global commodities market, we become detached in our divine senses, as our elders would tell us, divine senses located in our puku or our stomach or our liver, from the ancestral connections that that are forged intergenerationally through food. So it might be a really different way for people to think about food sovereignty, but that's how we talk about it in Indigenous communities. And then, of course, food sovereignty, as Vandana Shiva would say, begins in soil sovereignty, which begins in seed sovereignty. So we can't have food sovereignty without thinking about our beautiful soil. And the way we think about that is the deity of Hiniahuoni, our atua or our deity of soil, and everything we can do to lift and elevate her prestige, or what we call her mana. And then, of course, coming back to our really precious beginnings of our food system, which is our kākano, our seed. And so I can talk about this a little bit later, but I wanted to, suppose, help by framing up the conversation by sharing an ancient proverb of ours in our culture. And I'll say it in my language first and just listen to the resonance of the kupu of the words, and then I'll translate it to you. E koreo e ngaro e kākano I ruia mai I rangiatia. And in English, for I am not lost, I am a seed broadcast from the sacred homelands of Rangiatia. And that whakatauki or proverb really refers to the importance of the starting of our whakapapa, of our genealogy, as seeds, as kākano, coming from those sacred homelands of Rangiatia, Hawaii ki nui, Hawaii ki roa, Hawaii ki pāmamao. So our ancestors, when they arrived in Aotearoa hundreds of years ago, knew how important it was to carry seeds over in the waka, in the voyaging canoes when they came to Aotearoa, and also too how important it was to share stories through those seeds. So the attaching of stories to seeds is an important part of food sovereignty. Hoi anō, I'll just leave it there as a little bit of a start for our conversation.
Wow, Jessica, that was very deep and profound and beautiful. Thank you so much for grounding us in that place to approach this conversation, just bringing that added layer of depth. Kiira, the next question is for you. What are GMOs and why were they created? And then if you could touch on the connection between GMO seeds and pesticides a little bit.
Yeah. I want to echo your gratitude for Jessica's opening here too, because I think something that will be a thread through all of the comments today is the importance of looking at our food systems, life on Earth as a holistic and interconnected system. And some of the questions that I'll be talking to today are going to look at part of those fragments. So I guess I just want to honor that, Jessica, and then dive into some of the details, and I know Emmanuel can expand on them too. So the Non-GMO Project takes the topic of GMOs really seriously, obviously. We're a North American organization. We're operating in a place where the term non-GMO is not federally regulated, and neither are GMOs for that matter. And so we, as a 501c3 nonprofit, have aligned our definition with that of the Codex Alimentarius with the UN. And we see any organism that has had biotechnology techniques applied to it to be considered to be GMO. And that can be both transgenic, so taking the DNA from one organism and putting it into another, as we saw with a lot of the advent of GMOs in the 90s, or in more modern times, tinkering with the DNA itself via GMO 2.0 techniques like gene editing, and even creating synthetic sequences. And something that we always say in this conversation is just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? Again, thinking more holistically. GMOs came onto the scene in the 90s with traits that were adjusting corn and soy to withstand additional applications of herbicides, so kind of tying into that second question there. And they were really marketed to farmers by agrochemical companies who both were patenting these technologies of seed, which is something we can also discuss too, the advent of patenting life with the introduction of GMOs. But they're also selling this herbicides to the farmers as well. And in the case of herbicide-resistant soy, we saw that there's been a 15 times increase in the application of herbicides onto that land where the soy is grown when GMOs are present there. So that's pretty alarming. And we can talk all about potentially the pesticide treadmill and the longer implications of what that does when you're just looking at the short-term gain of, having an easier to manage piece of property. Yeah, and then there's lots to say too about other traits that have come in on the scene recently too, having promises for higher yield, looking at potential for increase in resistance to salinity, thinking about climate change impacts too. None of them have actually shown to be more beneficial in the long run. But yeah, so we're a market-based solution to hopefully address that and provide some clarity and some sovereignty on the behalf of eaters who are shopping and want to have some clarity about what's in their food system. So yeah.
Thank you, Kiira. It's really, I mean, I just want to acknowledge the contrast of seed sovereignty and our direct spiritual connection with our culture and our land, and what you're speaking to of like patenting life.
Yeah. And that's a GMO issue, right? Like seeds and the idea of patenting life wasn't something that came on until the 1980s and 90s when GMOs all of a sudden, because plants were now a product of human ingenuity, all of a sudden those can be patented. And now we even see patenting of seeds that are bred in traditional ways. And it's an interesting moral conundrum, I would say.
Well, I just have so many questions, and I'm sure a lot of you watching must too. So please add them in the chat and we will address them towards the end of the panel. We'll have an opportunity for everyone to ask, well, probably not everyone, but for some of you to ask some questions and dive deeper into these topics. So I'm just going to keep flowing through the questions for now. Emmanuel, the next one is for you. Based on some of the research papers that you've published and shared with us too, we didn't want to miss the opportunity to speak to the scientific and political intersect, and the risks that come in those spaces with introducing GMO varieties into an ecosystem, and how these risks extend beyond the environment and onto economic, cultural, and health perspectives.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'd like to start saying for Jessica and thanking her for her deep ideas and comments. I prepared a couple of few slides in order to make it, if it's possible, clearer. So I'll share the screen now. Let me just a second, please. here. I think you can see my screen now. So, well, answering the first question, it has been proved scientifically and in a daily basis, routines and protocols in agriculture, that the coexistence and containment of genetically modified crops is impossible. From a review from different points of times and different parts of the globe, studies published on biosafety and transgenic research, it has been proved that some genetically modified crops like bent grass in the USA, many many others crops like, for example, cotton, maize here in Mexico, have been escaped from the legally approved sites of sowing. So, well, and another issue that is accompanying this evidence is that in some places that are specifically named as, I don't know if I lost the here that yeah, sure, sorry, the places that are specially named as sites of centers of the diversity and origin of the crops, of the current crops. This issue of the transgenic scape is an additional problem because of the dispersal of transgene to native varieties of these crops and the wild relatives of these crops, which are in an ecological and biological and also an agroeconomical point of view, very relevant for the preservation of these crops. That only to say that in the context of these social, economical, cultural, biocultural issues, there are considerations named socioeconomic considerations which are implied in the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which is this all this international multilateral discussion in order to continually update the regulations on biosafety of genetically modified organisms. And a relevant quote that I just gathered to try to explain what the socioeconomic considerations are, let me read it for you. Taking into account a broad spectrum of concerns about the actual and potential consequences of biotechnology, such an impact on farmers' incomes, welfare, cultural practices, community well-being, traditional crops and varieties, what I just said, domestic science and technology, rural employment, trade and competition, and the role of transnational corporation, all these indigenous peoples for sure, food security, ethics and religion, consumer benefits, and importantly, the benefits and ideas about agriculture and food production. All these ideas are somehow the definition and wide definition of the socioeconomic consideration, which it's a pity that in this recurring and updating reunions of to update the regulation, the international regulations on biosafety of the genetically modified crops, these considerations aren't being very considered, let's say that like that. So nevertheless, there is a lot of importance of assessing socioeconomic impacts, like implying like the social responsibility, intergenerational responsibility. As Kiira said, for example, some of the harms that could the GMOs and the technological supplies that contain this technology, this biotechnology, transcends the generations. For example, the damages, the impacts of plaguicides, herbicides, are beyond this current or the previous generation. This is also some research that is missing yet. Another important aspect of the socioeconomic impacts is the social acceptance. For example, in Europe, there is a current discussion on the new forms of genetically modified of organisms, or not only crops, but mainly crops is the discussion about, but is this discussion and the potential impact is wider. And there are some specific economic considerations and social considerations. For example, and very important, the farmers' right to save seeds, which Jessica talked about previously. For example, the consumer health concerns, as I previously showed you, the coexistence and GMO contamination, and very important, as previously said, the intellectual property rights of this technology, which is important to say that these biotechnology developments are specifically designed to be released to the environment, because it's also impossible to perform agronomy, agriculture in greenhouses yet. So, well, maybe we can keep on the discussion in the question and answer part. Thank you.
Wow, Emmanuel, thank you so much for that very thorough and data-based response. I mean, the contamination of systems when a GMO seed is introduced. I loved how you spoke to the actual and the potential risks too, and how that spans beyond generations. I know for a lot of us, it can be challenging to think of the impact of our actions across multiple generations, but that is so important to be aware of not just the impact of what we're doing now, but the ripples that it will continue to have in time, which I know we'll touch on at a later point. But thank you.
Thank you.
Kiira, back to you. And I saw someone post this on the chat, and how GMOs are often promoted as a solution to feeding the world. And I wanted to ask you, do they truly address food insecurity?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, right? Because that's the promise of technology, that technological applications can save us from technological problems that have caused, I'm not trying to be dramatic, the poly crisis that we're facing today, right? And when you focus on something so specific as yield, right? Like the Gates Foundation is focused on getting more bushels per acre. That's what their aim is. When you're so focused on that, you lose sight of all the interconnections and all of the various issues that Emmanuel so greatly just showed us in that last slide. that are impacted, right? And so, and in addition to that too, we think about this as a really short-term solution for an immediate problem that doesn't take into consideration generations to come, right? And so if we're so focused on high yield, we're potentially degrading the soil and the communities that are growing those GMO crops and not preparing them and preparing the soil and preparing the ecosystem to support and be resilient for generations to come. And so I think it's an oversight and an overpromise for that technological fix. Something that we also talk a lot about at the Non-GMO Project is this concept of a precautionary principle, right? These are new technologies that have not been in the environment for very long. We're talking about crops like corn that are wind pollinated, and not only are they environmentally distributed, but then by our global food and industrial system are also shipped to Jessica's earlier points across the world. And so to presume that we as humans can tinker with something and that we now know that it will potentially save and fix all of our problems, I think is really naive. So just anchoring for us in that mindset, I feel like is really important. And just to say too that, there's been multiple studies done on this. GMOs that have been altered to promise higher yields, that just hasn't held true. So GMO side by side with non-GMO crops, not doing anything in terms of yield. And so I think with that introduction there too, I think a bigger question is like, what ways do GMOs actually threaten food security rather than promise it? And I think it's a potentially provocative question for all of us to consider and think about. And when we think about biodiversity as the basis for resiliency in any ecosystem, some interesting statistics here, right? Like 60% of the world's seed supply is owned by just four chemical companies, agrochemical companies. And so latch that on to some earlier comments around the patenting of seed and the decrease in disruption and potential for innovation at the local and community level where life is thriving. Like this is a real big problem for us. And at the Non-GMO Project, I think some, people know us for the little butterfly seal and the work that we do in the marketplace. And it's a small tool that's kind of nudging the system. We've created a non-GMO supply chain in GMO corn country, right? We've done that. But we need to really consider and think about the larger implications of this issue itself. And we've been talking a lot internally about how we evolve our contribution to the system to look at a higher level of integrity in the food system. And again, not just think about GMOs as that one issue, but how is that interrelated to everything else in the food system so that we can nourish life, so that we can eat and be connected to the land that is growing us and our communities. So that might feel kind of lofty, but it feels really important to name in this conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Kiira, for that perspective. And I mean, I can imagine how starting or with the work that you've all done at the Non-GMO Project and starting at the seed and non-GMO seed. And then as we spoke to at the beginning of the conversation, how that really touches every single step that comes after that, up until we eat it. So, yeah, thank you for that, for painting that fuller perspective. Jessica, this one is for you. I know you touched on earlier about how the history of seeds is deeply intertwined with cultural heritage. Could you share with us a little bit more about the origins of our seeds and how traditional seed stewardship connects to crop vitality and community resilience?
Sure. Before I go down that line of thought, I just want to add the words biocolonialism and biopiracy into our conversation. And so, Kiira, thank you for the mahi for the work that you're doing in the Non-GMO Project. Although we're waters away, we're following you down here because we've just had this introduction of the Gene Technologies Bill into the House in New Zealand and seeing a massive deregulation beyond the risk parameters that are in place in other countries of the world for GMOs if the legislation is to pass. So we've just had 100,000 submissions made on this bill, and it'll be really interesting and probably devastating to see where it lands up, because in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we've managed to keep GMOs out and we've fought really hard for it. So, that first wave of colonisation for Indigenous peoples came for our lands and our waters and our language, and this next wave of colonisation, often referred to as biopiracy or biocolonialism, is coming for our DNA of our whanaunga of our relations, our flora and our fauna and our kākano and our seeds. So definitely holding a very strong viewpoint on GMOs from an Indigenous standpoint down here. So the history of seeds deeply intertwined with cultural heritage, of course. For us, that history is held in what we call a pūrākau, and pū being the essence and rākau being the tree. It's like the essence of the stories that the tree can tell us. And so that's, I suppose, the word for our storytelling is our pūrākau. But when we share seeds or when we create Indigenous seed banks, what we do is we accentuate and elevate those pūrākau and those stories held within those seeds. And when we start to actively share and swap seeds amongst communities, not only are we enacting seed sovereignty, but more importantly, we're keeping our Indigenous knowledge connected to our biodiversity alive and in practice. When we stop speaking our stories in our mother tongue, within our communities, then those stories become lost for future generations. So it all becomes part of Indigenous language revitalisation work. The work around seed sovereignty is more than just the seed as the object for Indigenous peoples. This is about our cultural heritage, beginning by planting that seed in the soil, and then being able to grow that seed in those climatic conditions, and then being able to tell the story of that seed, the growing conditions, but also what ancestral voyaging wakas it might have come on, who were the ancestors who were on those waka. And this is then what makes the seed what we call a taonga or a treasure. So definitely seeds are deeply intertwined with our cultural heritage, especially if think back to when I spoke earlier about food sovereignty, Indigenous food sovereignty, being able to return to eat your cultural landscape. Seeds also, for us in our country in Aotearoa, we have a kumara or a sweet potato that finds its origins, if we trace back from here, all the way through the waters of the Pacific Islands of the Pacific, all the way up to Hawaii, down to Peru, and then down out to the islands of South America. That actually traces our whakapapa. If we trace the object of the seed or the kumara, we can actually trace thousands of years back where our people came from and where the migration and the pathway of that migration. So our seeds become much more than just an object to be commodified by bio-life sciences. They actually are the essence of what holds our story and are not roaming around there for, you know, capitalist patriarchy to pick up, to create patents on it, and then to kind of further that concentration of wealth and power into the hands of a few. So if our taonga seeds, our treasured seeds, the ones that are really special in our communities, ended up being, having GMO work done on them, ended up being commodified, it would be a deep hara, a deep harm that would be and is felt on a spiritual level for our people, and especially for our older people. Not only do we weep when our people die, when we have tangihanga, but we weep when parts of our environment die, including our seeds, because big parts of us die. Our ability to hold our language in relationship to those seeds and those stories die because we no longer have that tangible object that we're responsible to care for by passing the stories down through the seed. So it very much is a absolute lived reality. It's not a conversation that's out there and romanticized. What we're seeing in New Zealand at the moment post-COVID in Indigenous communities is a massive return to food security. And within that, we have food sovereignty, but people just need to eat right now. But what's beautiful with the connection between food security and food sovereignty is that Indigenous communities are wanting to grow, harvest and save the seed from our really special traditional crops. And so we're starting to see the emergence of a seed sovereignty movement in this country, which hasn't been at the forefront of our food sovereignty. I'd say First Nations people in Turtle Island are doing a lot more work. We've got a lot to learn from our relations in Turtle Island, and it's a really critical part of our resistance and our survival. And again, I come back to that beautiful proverb, e koreo e ngaro I kakano I roia mai rangiatia. I am not lost, you are not lost. We are seeds broadcast from the sacred homelands of Rangiatia. And when we hold that standpoint, then our relationship with seeds and our critique around seeds and GMOs becomes really clear. Yeah.
I mean, I am, it's so helpful to see the Indigenous stories and principles so tangibly applied in this relationship between humans and seeds, and the impact that could have, that has, as you said, not just at a physical level and how that affects our food as itself, but also as on a spiritual level, and the way that we're able or not to know where we come from and where our food comes from, that eventually becomes us.
Mm. Mm.
I know you've spoken a little bit about this, but in case you want to add anything else about the colonization of agriculture, or as you called it, biocolonization through GMO seeds, impact Indigenous seed sovereignty.
Thank you for this question. I think I've talked a little bit about this, but maybe just generally about the colonisation of agriculture in New Zealand, which is often seen from other parts of the world as being clean and green. Well, that's a complete myth, just first of all. Have highest loss of biodiversity anywhere in the world. We have the highest number of species on the red listing ecosystem list. The list just goes on and on and on. But what happened 200 years ago when we were colonized was that our landscapes changed and they became deforested, and we actually became the lands of rolling green pastures to feed the motherlands of England. And so then we started to see what I would describe as the colonization of agriculture. And Māori, Indigenous peoples, became the servants, the handmaidens to this form of mechanized technology. And so for many of our communities, many of our tribes, they've been locked into this paradigm of dependency financially, and also intergenerationally, because the connection to the land is through these very Western ways of farming, and that's been happening intergenerationally. And while people are still on their traditional lands, they've adopted farming practices which are reductionist, mechanistic, based on mechanized agriculture. They're monocrops. It's about growing and farming on our tribal lands and then putting that food into the export market, into the commodities market. And so, you know, that's kind of the current state in a very, very quick snapshot of agricultural colonisation in Aotearoa. We're great at it. We grow enough kai to feed 50 million people in New Zealand, but we can't even feed the 5 million people that we've got, and we export most of it off overseas. So when we talk about food insecurity, we actually have enough food to feed our people here. But 1 in 4 children in New Zealand live in food poverty, and the majority of those children are in brown bodies, Māori, Indigenous children and Pacifica children. But what I can see coming with this new gene technologies bill is that GMOs are now, you know, if this gets passed, will just end up finding their way into our agricultural systems as other technologies have. And so it just continues. You know, colonization is not something that happened mai rā 200 years ago. We live in an ongoing settler colonial reality every day in Aotearoa in New Zealand. We have to work hard to speak our language in a country which is dominated by English. So I think it's watch this space for us, very much leaning into what's been going on overseas, and more recently, the trust that I'm a founding trustee of, Papa Whakarito, and it's on our website, so I encourage you to have a look. Last year, we took a Indigenous Women's Declaration for Seed and Soil up to Navdanya to present it to Dr. Vandana Shiva at International World Food Day. And this is what you do as Indigenous women when nation states don't listen, when the international instruments that you've spent years, trying to get nation states to sign, like the UNDRIP, are no longer recognised, or the government of the day paying no attention to it. We have to work outside of the parameters of nation states and actually say, that's enough. Kotera, that's enough. You know, seeds and soil, these are our mokopuna, these are our grandchildren, these are taonga, and this is our declaration. And just in a quick snapshot again, the essence of the declaration is not to ascribe personhood status or legal rights for nature on seeds and soil, but it calls for a really deep return to an honoured and interconnected relationship back again with our environment, with our seeds and soil. It's calling again for a deep ecology return. That's what we're looking for. It's not words that we just say, oh, we're interconnected, everything's interconnected, biodiversity. It's at this time where the Indigenous women that I work with feel very strongly that we need to reconnect, that in 2 or 3 generations, we have lost this deep connection that we've had with nature, and we other her over there. So I think that's one of the things that I'd really encourage people to have a look at, the Manawahine Declaration for Seed and Soil. It's definitely the time energetically around the world where Indigenous women are rising, are speaking up and being very clear around our values and the ways forward. Yeah, kia ora, thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. To continue this thread of how colonization is not something that happened 300 years ago, but something that is a continuing cycle today. Emmanuel, if you could speak to, and I know we're running a bit tight on time, so moving forward, I know we could expand into these topics a lot more in depth, and I am eager to in the future. But for the context of this conversation, could you share with us a little bit about how and why the current dispute around GMO corn in Mexico is especially relevant to the context of this conversation?
Yep. Yeah, thank you. I'm sharing again the screen, trying to go as fast as I can. And as Jessica said, no, and just said that we are living in an ongoing process of colonization. Here's a snapshot of the colonization of the changes in the food and dietary processes in Mexico since the entrance of the.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Emmanuel. Are you sharing your screen now? Because we can't see it yet.
I'm sorry about that.
I can see the screen, Alana.
Oh, okay. I can't.
Yeah. I just stopped sharing the screen. Let me do it again.
There we go.
Yeah, I think that you can now see the screen. So here's a snapshot. We in 2017, we published an article exploring the horizon of the food made out of maize, industrially food made out of maize, and we found that something that was horrific. That's out of about 82% out of almost 400 different samples classified as cereals, flours, maize flours, corn flours, snacks, tortilla, which is this product, the base at the base of the Mexican food, and tostada, which is somehow like a fried tortilla, which is very present in daily basis meals on Mexican tables. And there were almost more than 90% of the tortilla sampled they tested positive for transgenic corn. So I totally agree with Jessica that we are just living in a continued colonization, and is very clear here now. And well, just going through the slides. Well, and this is an image. Sorry that this is in Spanish. I just loved it and didn't have time to translate it. And with what this says is that when you combine this megadiversity, biological megadiversity, and cultural megadiversity, you have all this richness of peoples, of foods, and which now sets Mesoamerica, Mexico, Guatemala also, as one of the cradles of agriculture, and which is currently disputed the 5th place in the top places of biodiversity in Mexico, and having this position that is currently at risk. So now, talking about this, what is currently happening here in Mexico, on the dispute in this war, this racist war from the north, trying to impose these types of feeding here in Mexico, in which the corn is the staple food here. I just made a quick timeline for the recent and most relevant news for in the case of corn in Mexico. In February of 2023, the former Mexican president published a decree banning the import of GM maize for the use and for its use in human consumption. We think that somehow like it came late, but this research, this investigation from ours, published in 2017, somehow made this ignite this political movements. So, well, in 2023, this decree was published then, and in the same year, some months later, the U.S. government challenged this Mexican policy and GMA's ban in the context of the new trade agreement between U.S., Canada, and Mexico, which is the USMCA. After several months, a trade panel ruled that this decree violated the terms of the trade agreement. Nevertheless, the Mexican government, the Science and Technology Council, presented a very strong and detailed document making point on the damages, the impacts of the presence of GM corn in the foods and in the fields in Mexico. The trade panel decided that the decree was not in sense of this commercial agreement. Recently, some days ago, the current Mexican president formally announced, as a response of this trade panel decision, that that 2 articles in the Mexican Constitution regarding the right to culturally adequate food, and another article ruling the conditions, the ideal conditions for agriculture. These amendments were aimed to enforce public policies prohibiting the sowing of GM in Mexico, and also prohibiting this GM maize in Mexican foods. Here I made a mistake, but just yesterday, this amendment to the Mexican Constitution was recognized and approved by the Congress. So now currently there is as stated in the Constitution that Mexico doesn't allow GMAs to be in the agriculture and in the food of Mexicans. So just to be, it's a very happy news, but I have to say that there are many other steps missing to really enforce this constitutional amendment, like regulation, secondary laws, and the government institutions, which institutional government policies could also enforce this decision, that which in the reality will be somehow difficult. But here we are trying to preserve the native seeds and the rights of the peasants and Mexican citizens to nutritious and healthy food. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Emmanuel, for that timeline, and that it was just yesterday that we saw it recognized in the Constitution. That's incredible. It makes me really curious to think of all these like necessary supportive laws that you're speaking to, especially when you shared the rates on like the amount of pesticide and GMO corn present in, I think it was over 80 or 90% of the corn that Mexicans eat in the tortillas. And how is that such a big gap? How is there such a big gap between the regulations that are happening at a constitutional level and what we're eating as consumers?
Yeah, it's like the ideal world being in the Constitution, the right of nutritious and healthy foods, and what is sown in the fields of Mexican peasants and producers, and what we see actually in the food, in the commercial foods, since the rolling in the context of the USMCA trade agreement, pointing that the arguments presented by Mexico were not in the sense of the trade agreement. Actually, Mexico will continue to import corn from the USA, which I don't know, maybe Kiira has more recent numbers, but I think that 90% of the corn produced in the USA is transgenic in order to resist pests or tolerant to herbicides like glyphosate. So it's an ongoing battle, let's say like that. But I think that the first steps are already taken. Another thing that I would like to point out is that here in Mexico, in the popular imaginary, is that transgenic maize, specifically transgenic maize, is the one that has been banned. But actually, I made this correction to the new nationwide newspaper in order to point that the amendment in the Constitution refers to genetically modified maize, in order that, considering that currently the genetic engineering is going very fast forwarding in these new techniques that allows the genetic modification of crops or living organisms. So taking this wide view and represent specifically presented in this law in the Mexican Constitution, like somehow like protect this future advances in the precaution principle from this like very fast steps of biotechnologies. And well, the commercial side of the presence of genetically modified maize is like in very steps forward from this legal modification and updates. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Emmanuel. I mean, thank you for shedding light in some of the ways in which international political interests and negotiations that happened at a state or business level impact all of us and what we eat, when we eat, especially with GMOs being so many of the staples, our food staples around the world. So just to close us off, Kiira, as consumers who might not be following every day the regulations around GMOs, and what role can we play in avoiding GMOs and participating in more resilient food systems?
Yeah, this has been such a lovely conversation, and I feel really grateful to be here with you both, Emmanuel, Jessica, and you too, Alana. What's going through my mind right now is that Wendell Berry quotation that eating is an agricultural act, and that thread is really present in some of the things that Jessica shared with us about eating being an opportunity for us to connect with nature, right? And I'm talking from an American context where when we go to the grocery store, 70% of the products on shelves are ultra processed. So you think about how many layers it takes for an eater, that means all of us, to be connected to that natural place, to themselves as part of nature, as part of this living system. It's an opportunity that we don't really have anymore. And so the stance that the Non-GMO Project is taking now is one really looking at food integrity across issue areas in the food system and thinking about unlocking eater consciousness and awareness that when I eat foods that are grown well by people who are cared for, that are tending and are stewards of the land, I feel better. And we can break that down in many different ways, right? But if we look specifically in one issue that we're starting to tackle right now that I just mentioned is that ultra-processed food one. If we look at specifically how the degradation of mental health and of our metabolic health and all of the issues that are diet-related disease that are popping up here. It's like if we start to really focus on nourishing ourselves so that we feel better, we can unlock parts of ourselves more consciously to actually tackle all of the things that we heard about here today. And that's a really ambitious goal for us. Obviously, our tool and our instrument is a certification, which we jokingly say is a shortcut to trust. And while that shortcut is a good thing in a big industrial globalized system, it also is indicative of the fact that the system itself is that it's broken, it's not transparent, it's not clear. And so I don't know that I have tons of solutions to offer here other than I have a lot of hope and faith that food is a really amazing nodal intervention, a connection point for all of us here. And I'm feeling that energy with all of you here today. So again, lots of gratitude for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiira. Well, that is the last slide that we have here, and I mean, so much gratitude for, I'm sorry, I'm gonna change locations because I am in a really loud city. Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives and knowledge with all of us today. I know we're a little bit over time, but if any or all of you are able to stay for a couple more minutes, I don't want to miss the opportunity to open up the floor for those of you who are joining us today in case you have any questions to share with our speakers. Please feel free to go off mute and just ask if you have something, or drop your question in the chat too, and I can read it.
Can we just jump in?
Yeah, please.
Hi. Hi. I just wanted to congratulate everybody for the quality of depth of every speaker and the people who are participating. I'm the one who talked about, the GMO being, I remember so vividly an interview of someone said it would, the whole magnificence of it when it was coming on the marketplace. And your explanation, who gave it, was so, so, so deep and so informative that it shifted a little bit of my own perspective of like, like almost like, oh no, not GMO. And so in speaking about it, I just wonder if there's a way of shifting away from the GMO identification to it opening up a new perspective to it, because just the words, are like a nail on a chalkboard. So that's just my perspective. But thank you for all your work.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm not sure if you had a specific question for that, or if it was more.
I guess not. It was just more of, like a bravo, brava. Thank you. And you gave some hope in this climate. So I guess it wasn't, I had already asked the question and I wanted to comment on the response that shifted me. So thank you.
Thank you so much for jumping in and sharing that, Ruth. That is our aim. That is our goal with these conversations. So I feel so complete. I see the heads and nods of some of our team members, and we're really grateful for all of you, the speakers and attendees, for taking the time to sit with us in these dialogues. And yeah, we will share out the recording, resources, and continue to expand on this topic through our storytelling and community for the coming months. So without further ado, just so much gratitude for all of you, and hope to speak more into these very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks all.